Today we're going to be using Jmac clay. Jmac is a very soft clay. This is a medium, but it feels a little bit softer. So it comes in these very large bricks, and I cut it, I put it in the microwave for a couple of minutes, and I got a bunch of goo. It's a little easier to work with this, and since I'm creating a base, I just want to get the clay onto the piece of wood that I have. I always start the sculptures with a base like this. I do love the way this clay feels. It feels probably the closest thing to water-based clay than any other clay. But the problem is that I'm finding is that it's just simply too soft. And in this sculpture, I'm sculpting a chimp holding a skull. And one of the things that I found is the smaller the sculpture, the more detailed the sculpture, the harder it is to use this particular clay. But it works really well. Sometimes I heat up a torch and a paint scraper so I can cut through the brick of clay a lot easier. So just using a paint scraper and nice and hot, I carefully just cut it. It makes it much easier to work with smaller blocks. This is of course Jmac clay, which is called J. McLaughlin clay, and it's the alternative to monster clay. Monster clay is much more expensive, but monster clay I believe has a little bit more wax than this one. This one just feels great. It does feel very similar to terracotta. When it's this soft, it's very easy to work. And normally, of course, you start out with an armature for these, but I did not start with an armature because I did not know what I wanted. And at this point, I still don't know the theme. I'm kind of just, I want to sculpt a chimp, and that's pretty much all that I have in my head. But here is the weakness of this particular sculpture. It's working small details. When you work this small, almost figurine size, it's very difficult to use a very soft clay. And that's the great thing about water clay is that it gives you the looseness kind of like this clay, and it also gives you the detail with sculpture like something like a monster clay or something that's much harder. Because water clays, you can vary it. You can vary it to be hard, you can vary it to be soft, just by wetting the clay or just letting the clay sit without any water. But on oil clay, it's like one consistency. So in a way, water-based clay might be a little bit harder to learn to sculpt, but it has a lot more flexibility than oil-based clay. Chimp anatomy is extremely similar to humans. You know, a chimp's body is very similar to humans. We have the same bones, muscles, the same nervous system, and the same number of fingers and toes. There are very large differences, and as large, I mean, for example, longer arms and shorter legs. One of the big differences, of course, in the skull is the extremely heavy brow ridges that extend well in front of the cranium. Of course, the modern human skeleton is just much larger in size compared to a chimp. And the chimpanzee has longer arms, it's got a narrower rib cage, smaller skull compared to both humans and ancient hominids. On the other hand, an hominid had a robust bone joint, allowing more flexibility. The skeleton structure of the chimpanzee indicates that they move by using 4 limbs, while humans and hominids walked upright. Similarities when you look at limb structures of the chimp and humans is that they evolved from the same 4-legged ancestors, which lived about 365 million years ago. And of course, they share the same DNA. Chromosomes 2 and 10 are different between humans and chimps. Another very interesting thing to note is that chimps are 4 times stronger than humans. So a lot of people don't think that when you see cute little chimps on TV and YouTube, but they are much stronger than an average human male. So at this point, I wanted to build something for the chimp to kind of sit. I didn't want him to just be on a platform. So I decided to use a tree trunk. So he's kind of resting against the tree trunk. And it's when I was researching the anatomy of a chimp, I found it very difficult to get rear view shots of chimps as well. So this kind of hides a little bit of the anatomy that I can't really research. And at this point, I got the human skull on the hand, and I am working with a little bit of the sizing. And I'm going to make a nice clean cut for the arm because I want to be able to put the arm in and out. And now at this point, I decided that I'm going to use a different clay. And this clay is, I believe it's Roma plasticina. It's a much harder clay. And I like this for anything that involves detail. So the human skull, I found it extremely difficult to sculpt it because the Jmac clay was just way too soft. So I am using this clay, and I have quite a bit of it. A friend of mine just gave it to me. He stopped sculpting and he gave it to me. So I'm going to use this, and I'm going to sculpt the skull. And I also hollowed this out because I don't want a lot of weight, and you can see that the skull kind of moves down. And I wanted the skull and the chimp to kind of be staring at each other's eyes. So the other hand, they have very similar hands, but their bones are longer. And it is very difficult because sometimes the position that I want, I can never find online. So I have to do a lot of research for the hand. But this clay looks distinctively different. And I like how hard it is because you can really create some interesting details. So at a certain point, I'm like, okay, I could just sculpt the hand, the skull with it, or I could just cover the entire chimp with a kind of a skin from that. And I think that's what I decided to do here. At this point, I'm like, okay, this clay, even though I'm kind of blending them together, it's going to be a little bit easier to use than kind of messing around with the Jmac clay that's so soft. You know, the Jmac clay is great for maybe the initial buildup, but when it comes to something this small, what I'm learning is that the Jmac clay and monster clay are very different. The monster clay has got a little bit of wax, and this particular clay is not monster clay, but it's very similar. So at this point, I removed the tree trunk, and what I'm doing is putting in books. So I'm sculpting an open book right in front of him. I didn't want to have a base that was too simple, so if I mold it, it'll have some detail on it. But I also don't want to put too much detail into the base. So let's put it all together so we can look at it. At this point, I received my monster clay. So the monster clay that I'm going to be using, I am going to be removing the head, and I am going to be resculpting the head with monster clay. First thing I noticed is that it's very difficult to get it out of that pan. But the pan is made so you can just put it in the microwave and melt it. I'm using a hair dryer just to get the clay nice and soft. You can tell the color difference, and right away, one thing that I found is that this clay is very similar to the whitish green clay that I'm using for the hand and the human skull. But it does feel much different than the Jmac clay. The Jmac clay, when you're sculpting and you're scraping, there's particles that kind of leave and crumble, which I don't like. On this one, it doesn't feel like that. It feels like it holds the detail much better, but it doesn't give you that looseness quality that Jmac clay has. So if you're more of a loose sort of sculptor, you'll want to use Jmac clay. And if you are more of a detailed and doing more like superhero sort of sculpture, you want to use the monster clay. So let's put it back in the head. And I got my neck too big, so this is in comparison the other one. and the new one. So I just want to get the proportions right. And one thing I found is that I'm missing just a little bit of the skull, so I'm going to add a little bit more to the chimp skull. That way it doesn't look too weird. But I do find that this clay is really nice to use, and it just holds the details so much better when you're working at this size. If you look at my hand in comparison, you'll see that this is a significantly small sculpture. And some of these tools, this wooden tool for example, was made by me using some music guitar wire, and it seems like that's something that a lot of artists use online, and I think I haven't done a video on how to make these, and it's very easy. You just go to the guitar shop, I believe, or the music store, buy a bunch of, I think, over 20 gauge or 16 gauge wire, and then you have the ability of making these tools. And I am so cheap that I just bought like a bunch of like sticks that I had and just made that tool. I still prefer the scraping tools with the teeth like I'm using, but that to get into the head so you can finesse the head's details is much better, because you can't see a lot of that scraping texture when you pull back. So let's put it back into the body, and we need to compare the size to the body. So there is a danger of sculpting things apart, is that sometimes tends to get way too big and way too small, so you want to put it back together once in a while. But you can start to see the theme of it, and I am going to be leaving the arms and the head off, so it's going to have that cut, because I want to try and learn how to make a mold out of it, and that's the reason. So the open book, I do plan on putting in some minor details. The book that he's reading, of course, is Darwin's Theory of Evolution. So I decided to remove some of these books. I thought they didn't really add much to it. Okay, it's books, but I think a lot of it too is when you mold make these things, they just kind of get in the way, and there is a part that you have to go like, okay, that's too much. So I don't even know, like I might remove a few more, because I want to make sure that they look like they are books, but also that they add to the sculpture instead of detract. So I might still make some changes here. I'm not sure just yet. So the head is monster clay, the other is roma clay. You can see some of the differences in color, but they do work just about the same. So here's another tool that I made, and the wetness is basically a thinner, some paint thinner. Paint thinner lets the clay a little bit softer, and I'm just kind of blending the arm together. So here's the difficult part, is that you want to continue that muscle, that muscle in the forearm. So I still plan on removing the head so I can mold it separately, but I want to have a line there. And I think I'm going to make a line because it's going to be the part where the fat is kind of folding onto each other. That way it'll be a registration point for the sculpture. And you're starting to see some details here. There are some lines for the face of the chimp, but if you use a bristle brush and some paint thinner, you should be able to kind of smooth those out so they're not as obvious. And this tool that I'm using, it's a dental tool, and it works pretty well because you can get into the eyes and create a little bit of the expression. So I think at this point I am pretty close to finish. I just have to create some different texture for the body. I don't want to leave it so haphazardly, and I also want to get some details onto the book. But we're almost done with it, and I first made the video of this and I decided that this was going to be just a study, but I'm kind of pushing it for a finished sculpture, and I'm hoping that I can make a mold of it. Alright, that's the sculpture for today. I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you in the next sculpture.